Today, I would like to go into more detail over one of the aircrafts that I've made a long time ago. In one of my longer videos, probably my longest video up to this point, where I go over nearly every single aircraft I have ever made in my entirety of me playing this game. And around 11 minutes in is when I finally get to start talking about these, and I think it drags on a lot. So I thought I would dedicate one video just to talk about these and how they work. Now, at the beginning of that video, you probably saw the quadcopter layout, and these are much more refined versions of essentially that same thing. So before I talk about these, this is the base model. This is the essentially what it is. This aircraft is called the DRO-5 Vertigo. This is the base model. The yellow one is the utility variant, and the red one is the attack variant. Here I have a bomber version, and this is a more recent kind of sporty, tuned up version of the attack one. And then these are some other high performance aircraft I'll get to later. So for now, I think I'll start with the general functions. There's a passenger seat, which doesn't do anything. The pilot seat follows the same layout as all of my other aircraft. 2 and 3 is roll, 4 and 5 is pitch. Number 1 just turns the whole thing on. Number 6 opens and closes the claws. There are sets of thrusters on bearings that are responsible for the steering. Number 7 doesn't do anything on this one, and number 8 is a rollover mechanism in the event that you fall on your back. Everything on this serves a purpose. And I think I should start with the rotors. In the first version, the quadcopter layout, it actually depended upon these to provide the upwards lift in order for it to fly. But I later found out that the gyroscopic precession, especially having counter-rotating discs, the gyroscopic precession acted as a damper or a sort of kinetic resistor for other maneuvers like pitch and roll. One problem with other aircraft is when you do make a roll maneuver or a pitch maneuver, it's easy for that momentum to make it continue turning in the said direction. With these spinning masses, it mitigates some of that and acts as to slow it down, which can make which makes it easier to fly and more predictable. One very defining feature to these, and you may have noticed already, is the holding down the 2 and 3 key engages an extra set of lift. The roll, the thrust provided along the roll axis is not perfectly symmetrical. It is mirror symmetric along the lengthwise direction of the craft, but it is not vertically symmetric in the sense that the thrusters that push down on one side versus the ones that push up on the other opposing side, when rolling, is they are weaker. This alone isn't really too apparent, but pressing them together, pressing them apart, the asymmetry does give it an extra bit of lift. This is useful for if you want to do much finer maneuvers, like for say landing, where you may want to think about it much more like a real-life landing, where you want to land on the ground as smoothly as possible. It gives you a good chance to really coordinate your position before actually touching down. To improve performance, again, I made it so that only when the 2 and 3 key are being held together, it will also activate another set of thrusters. This is that is only actually put into place on the other versions, which I'll get to now. Since this is the base model, it's of course the most mundane. For the utility variant, it essentially functions exactly the same, only the number 7 key activates another set of thrusters that provides an extra boost of lift without the number 1 key being necessary. As well as the, you can see here, the 2 and 3 keys do provide that extra force, but only when they're being held together do they fire an extra set of thrusters on the control arms. This is meant for lifting heavy things. It's somewhat more maneuverable because of that extra lift. As I preferably use this to get around, you can perform some high G maneuvers, banking, and of course if you hit the ground, it's not too hard to recover. And if you do land on your back, number 8 will roll you back over. So that's the utility version. You may have also noticed that the claws are actually different, slightly different than the others. Now we're at the attack variant. The attack variant is essentially a souped up version of the utility one designed for combat. The sets of thrusters that provided extra lift for the number 7 key are now connected to the 2 and 3 plus. The other thrusters have been added at the front and back to make it even more responsive. And extra thrusters have been added at the back to make it even faster. This is by far my favorite. It can handle a lot, and it's obviously very, very fast. Ever since I removed the spring systems, you can slam these into walls at top speed and they'll be just fine, as long as you don't manage to clip them inside of something. you can be pretty aggressive with these in terms of what you do to them. Like I'll demonstrate here. And then you can just keep going. Now, and like that. Those are the pros. Now I'll get to the cons. The first being it's made of cardboard, which is fairly fragile. Well, I mean, it can be destroyed by the potato guns. I went with this again to try to increase the thrust to mass ratio, well, as much as possible, because you know the next best thing, which would be the woodblock 3, which has the highest strength to weight ratio, would make this effectively twice as heavy, which one could argue would make it perform twice as worse. Oh, another thing, the rotors on the other versions are turned all the way up. All the thrusters on them are running at full power. However, a few of the thrusters, well, 2 thrusters on each rotor are turned down slightly. This is so that they spin slower. And you might wonder, why would I want these spinning slower if they're damping the rotation? Well, if say you're in combat and you need to turn really fast, not only do they resist any residual motion, but they also resist any current velocities, including accelerating velocities, which makes it harder to turn, easier to stop turning, harder to turn, basically. So by turning it down, you've traded some of the ease of flight for its performance capability in the roll and pitch directions. Now these do not govern the yaw axis because they are along the yaw plane of rotation. These two here do something about that, but effectively, in combat, which is what this is primarily designed for, well, this version of it, the main weakness would be its control arms. And you may think, well, wouldn't the rotors be really important? Because anything spinning and moving is important, just like how the propellers of a racing drone or helicopter are important. These are not essential to its flight in any manner. The only thing they contribute is the extra thruster for steering and lift, and then the damping. You could cut all of these off and you could still fly it, albeit it would be very, very hard. The biggest weakness is the control arms. Since these govern the roll axis, they are, and that's the most sensitive direction and most dependent direction axis for these. They are its greatest weak point. And now it wouldn't be as bad as a aircraft where it was symmetrical, because even if you lost one arm, you would still have a nearly symmetric force on the other side. Since these are supposed to act in tandem when providing extra lift, without the lengthwise mirror symmetry, them counteracting each other, it can induce a very, very violent roll, which can make it nearly impossible to fly. since being able to hold the 2 and 3 at the same time to gain altitude is imperative to its function. I tried to take what I had learned from these with the damping and such and asymmetric roll and implemented it into these aircraft. These are not intended for combat at all. These have a sole purpose of being performance, to be as fast as possible and as light as possible. That's why a lot of this has a very skinny, bare minimums cardboard structure. I'll start with this one because this has the most interesting story, and it was the first. To reduce part count, I mean, you can make an aircraft with no parts. It will just depend a lot on the logic systems and button inputs. Like these, they use bearings and such for the yaw axis control, and obviously the rotors. The yaw is governed by a very sensitive turning thing. I don't know what you'd call this. Steering converter. And you also may notice that these are angled. This is such so that, well, if you know anything about rotational vector dynamics, you'll know that, well, okay, the first version of this, there was only two. There are only two rotors. And under normal circumstances, I guess that would be fine. But what I didn't realize is that while from top down they are spinning in the same direction, well, spinning in opposing directions, from the side, their vector component adds up to a vector sum that would initiate a, that would produce a pitch vector that I didn't want. And that's why there are two sets opposing each other. It's very hard to fly, primarily because of how these are on, I guess how you'd say, fragile connections. If you turn hard enough, you can get them to hit each other, which is not desirable at all. So in the next version, I addressed this, making a more rigid structure, albeit much wider, which is not very desirable for performance. Again, it has the same steering thing. This only has 9 bearings, which is the lowest part count any of my aircraft have ever had since a very, very, very long time. Now, it's not as fast, I guess, as maybe the attack variant, but that's because I'm not pressing the number 6 key, as I just did now. To properly fly this, you would want both hands on the keyboard, ready to do all kinds of crazy things, like banking maneuvers and accelerating very fast, and then bumping into something very fast. It's hard for me to fully demonstrate just how fast these can go in this world. Well, a terrain world would be a good example for just how much you can push these But yeah, this is the closest I've ever gotten to a thoroughbred racing aircraft. You can also maneuver it somewhat gently if you're good enough. And of course it has that second feature that I don't know why I didn't decide to connect to the seat. But that was all that. This is that tuned up version that I mentioned. Compared to the performance aircraft, you can tell it's much slower. And not nearly as agile. But nonetheless, they perform great. I have some more advanced aircraft, or, well, maybe not advanced aircraft. I have aircraft that implement more advanced logic and thrust vectoring tactics than these. One example I'll just talk about right now is when at least I do a banking maneuver, I start pitching prematurely to when the aircraft is at a 90-degree angle. And this is partly to try to preserve lift. But one side effect is it relative to likely where you intended to go, you will find yourself having a yaw direction that will point you upwards. One way to mitigate this is by setting up the asymmetric roll so that the axis at which the aircraft rotates is different. If if I'm going this way and I turn this way without hitting the wall, it will effectively yaw to the right. So by angling, and so all of these, they have the roll vector, or not the roll vector, the roll axis is symmetrically running along the lengthwise direction of this. If I say angled it so that from a top-down point, the roll axis for, say, rolling left was, say, going from the back left rotor to the front left rotor, I would get a pitch vector out of this. And what that would allow is to counter the extra yaw that I get in that maneuver, pitching prematurely. And it's not bound specifically to that axis. The roll left is bound to the axis that runs from the back left to the front right, but the roll right is the opposite. It runs from the back right to the front left. Now, it all just depends on clever logic usage. If you really want to go far enough, you could add a timer delay circuit to check if both of the roll components have been activated at the same time and you're currently doing a pitch maneuver. It will give you extra lift and extra upward pitch to help with the bank. I haven't implemented that yet. But that's one thing those are some things that I'm implementing in a newer version of combat drone um, that will feature a small bomb cannon built in. This is the bomber. It's slow and it's heavy, um, and I don't like it, but it's fun. You can position yourself over top of a target and press number 6. Um, it tries to compensate for the balance change by activating and deactivating thrusters around it. Like you'll notice, almost directly beneath the rotors, or the only stationary thruster on the rotor arms, all of them are active except for the thruster, all for the corresponding corner for the bomb that just dropped. Um, it helps with the balance. It doesn't completely solve it, but it's a nice feature. It makes it bearable to fly. And when you don't have the bombs anymore, it feels pretty smooth. Not as heavy at all. Um, and thank you for watching. That will be all for today.